A courtroom, a microphone, and a moment that lands heavier than any accusation. The head of South Africa's prosecuting authority, tasked with steering the country's most sensitive corruption cases, openly concedes uncertainty about the very files meant to restore public faith. Not confusion about a minor detail, not a technical hiccup, a frank admission that lands like a dropped gavel, echoing through a justice system already strained by years of broken promises and delayed accountability. What follows from that admission is not just embarrassment or political noise. It opens a deeper question about whether South Africa's fight against corruption is stalled by complexity, undermined by quiet pressure, or hollowed out by something more dangerous: institutional paralysis. By the end of this story, the issue is no longer whether cases are hard to prosecute, but whether the system itself still knows how to move decisively when power is on trial. Think about this carefully. If the person entrusted to lead corruption prosecutions cannot clearly explain where the strongest cases stand, what does that signal to investigators, to judges, and to citizens who have waited years for justice? And more importantly, what does it signal to those who believe they will never be held accountable? The admission did not arrive with shouting or drama. It came calmly, almost clinically, wrapped in legal language and procedural caution. That calmness is precisely what made it unsettling. In spaces where confidence is expected, uncertainty becomes a message of its own. Silence, after all, can speak louder than denial. For years, Shamila Batohi was presented as a reset button, a clean break from the era when prosecutions appeared selective, compromised, or deliberately stalled. Her appointment carried enormous symbolic weight. It told the country that competence and integrity had returned to the National Prosecuting Authority. Expectations were sky-high, and patience, initially, was generous. But time has a way of hardening goodwill. As months turned into years and commissions produced volumes of evidence, the absence of decisive courtroom outcomes became harder to explain away. Each delay added another crack. Each postponed case quietly rewrote the public contract between citizens and the justice system. In that context, an admission of being unsure about corruption cases doesn't land as honesty alone. It lands as confirmation of what many had begun to suspect: that something, somewhere, is not working as promised. Uncertainty at the top rarely stays there. It filters down through institutions like a slow leak, soaking morale, decision-making, and urgency. Prosecutors become cautious. Investigators hesitate. Files grow thicker but not sharper. Everyone waits for someone else to move first. The system becomes busy without being effective. This is how paralysis masquerades as process. Meetings replace momentum, reviews replace rulings, and complexity becomes the perfect shield because no one can argue against it without sounding naive. Corruption cases are complex, yes, but complexity alone cannot explain years without major convictions. Early on, the narrative was simple and reassuring. State capture had hollowed out institutions. Rebuilding would take time. Strong cases require meticulous preparation. Courts demand airtight evidence. All of that is true. But truth, stretched too long, begins to lose its persuasive power. The gap between promise and performance has now become impossible to ignore. When expectations were set, they were set publicly. The country was told that accountability would come, that no one would be untouchable, that evidence would finally meet consequences. Each unfulfilled promise quietly lowered the bar of what people believed was possible. At some point, explanations stop feeling like context and start feeling like cover. That point is where public trust begins to erode in a more dangerous way, not with anger, but with resignation. And resignation is fatal to democratic accountability. Supporters of the NPA leadership argue that corruption cases inherited from the state capture era are uniquely difficult. Paper trails were deliberately obscured. Witnesses were intimidated or compromised. Money flowed through sophisticated networks designed to evade detection. All of this is true, But difficulty does not absolve leadership from clarity. Clarity is not about revealing every legal strategy. It is about demonstrating command. When a leader cannot articulate where the strongest cases stand, which obstacles are real and which are being overcome, confidence drains away. And without confidence, authority weakens. There is also a subtle but important difference between caution and hesitation. Caution sharpens cases. Hesitation dulls them. The longer files sit unresolved, the more memories fade, the more witnesses disappear, the more narratives harden against prosecution. Time in corruption cases rarely favors justice. The shadow of state capture still looms large, not because it is unresolved history, but because its consequences are unfinished business. Commissions exposed networks, named actors, and traced flows of money. For a brief moment, it seemed like the hardest work had been done. Evidence was public. The nation watched. Momentum felt real. Then the momentum slowed. Files moved quietly behind closed doors. Updates became vague. The language shifted from certainty to process, from timelines to caution, and now from caution to open uncertainty. Inside the NPA, the challenges are real. Skilled prosecutors are stretched thin. Experienced investigators are in short supply. Salaries cannot compete with the private sector. Morale has taken hits from years of political interference and public skepticism. These are structural problems, not personal failings. But leadership is measured by how it navigates constraints, not by how often it points to them. When capacity challenges dominate the narrative, they begin to sound like excuses rather than explanations, especially when the stakes are as high as national credibility. Public confusion has a cost. It doesn't always explode in protest. Sometimes it settles into apathy. People stop following cases. Headlines blur together. Another scandal feels inevitable rather than shocking. That is how corruption becomes normalized, not through acceptance, but through exhaustion. Political pressure rarely announces itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with written instructions or recorded threats. It shows up as hesitation, as advice to be careful, as reminders of broader stability. It lives in phone calls that leave no trace and meetings that produce no minutes. And it thrives in environments where leadership signals uncertainty. When accountability lacks consequences, oversight becomes performance. Reports are written, hearings are held, statements are issued, but outcomes remain elusive. The appearance of action replaces action itself. Over time, institutions learn that survival depends more on managing optics than delivering results. Halfway through this story, it's worth asking a simple question. If this uncertainty were happening in a private company with billions at stake, would shareholders accept it? Or would leadership already have changed? Justice, strangely, is often asked to operate with lower performance expectations than commerce. There is a persistent belief that the biggest corruption cases must come first, that securing one massive conviction will restore trust overnight. In reality, this strategy often backfires. Large cases are slow, fragile, and vulnerable to collapse. Smaller, consistent convictions do more to rebuild credibility than one elusive blockbuster. Quietly, many prosecutors admit frustration. Off the record, they speak of cases ready to move, stalled by caution above them. They speak of fear, fear of losing high-profile cases, fear of political fallout, fear of being blamed for institutional failure. Fear is not a legal principle, but it shapes behavior. Looking beyond South Africa, other countries facing systemic corruption have learned painful lessons. Speed matters. Consistency matters. Independence must be visible, not just claimed. Where prosecutors act decisively, even imperfectly, deterrence grows. Where they hesitate, corruption adapts. Media plays a complicated role in this landscape. At times, it exposes wrongdoing bravely. At others, it amplifies official narratives without sufficient challenge. When explanations go unquestioned, accountability softens. The public hears reassurance instead of scrutiny. There is also a legal reality many overlook. Prosecutors must meet a high burden of proof. Suspicion is not evidence. Public outrage is not admissible in court. These constraints are real and necessary, but they do not require leaders to appear uncertain about their own case pipelines. At this stage, interpretations begin to diverge sharply. Some see incompetence, others see strategy. Is uncertainty a sign of being overwhelmed or a deliberate slowing to avoid political earthquakes? The answer matters less than the effect. Both produce the same outcome: no accountability. Long-term damage accumulates quietly. Young lawyers lose faith in public service. Citizens disengage from civic processes. Corrupt actors adjust their calculations, reassured by delay. Justice systems, once weakened, are not easily repaired. Real reform would demand more than speeches or reshuffles. It would require protected budgets, independent appointment processes, measurable timelines, and consequences for failure. It would require leadership willing to risk losing cases in pursuit of momentum rather than losing credibility through delay. And so the question now hanging over the NPA is not whether corruption cases are difficult. Everyone knows they are. The question is whether the institution still believes it can win them. Because belief in systems like these shapes action long before verdicts do. If uncertainty continues to define the narrative, the admission heard in that room will echo far beyond a single moment. It will become a reference point. The day confidence slipped into doubt, and doubt threatened to become the new norma.